and I will turn it over to you, Sam.
Okay, thanks. And thanks to everybody for coming today. Welcome to the Humanity Center Book Club. Today we are talking about Miracle Country, and we have the author, of course, with us to help us do that. So let me just introduce Kendra briefly, and then we can start talking about the book. So Kendra Atleework is the author of Miracle Country, a memoir of a family and a landscape. It was the winner of the Sigurd F. Olson Nature Writing Award. It also won the 2021 Women Writing the West Willa Literary Award for creative nonfiction. I think that's an award named after Willa Cather, if I'm not mistaken. And then she's also, the book is also a 2021 pick for Nevada's statewide book club, Nevada Reads. And that's, of course, a big reason why we're doing it now. So Kendra got her BA at Scripps College and holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Minnesota. She has been awarded fellowships and residencies from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Anderson Center, and the Minnesota State Arts Board. Her writing has appeared in Best American Essays, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Los Angeles Times, and other publications. She's a recipient of the Ellen Meloy Desert Writers Award, and she currently lives in her hometown of Bishop, California, where she's roaming the mountains and deserts and working on her garden. So thanks for joining us, Kendra. I don't want to take up a lot of the time with, my interests and questions, but I just wanted to get things started with sort of a general question, and then you can just sort of take it and go with it where you will. So I was just kind of interested in all of the numerous threads that you sort of bring together in this book. Mary Austin and William Mulholland were a couple that I was particularly interested in, but feel free to, discuss any other things, any aspects of the history or the water rights stuff in particular, or all the various texts that you reference, like just anything that sort of played a large role in the overall composition of the book or, affected you powerfully in some way. And then maybe you could touch on how you sort of melded some of that with your own personal family history.
Yeah, so thanks for having me, everybody. Hi, nice to meet everyone. Yeah, great question. I really enjoyed bringing a bunch of different sources together while writing this book. It was probably the most fun part of it was, I read this, I found this newspaper article from 1905, and how does this resonate with today, and how does this resonate with my own experience of the place and my family? So figuring out how all of that was going to go together was really fun, but also why the book took 6 years to write, because it was really hard. It was the hardest part of writing this book, was figuring out. At first I would have these massive chapters that would be like, okay, the water is an important part, so I'm going to have this whole chapter about the water in LA and LA's relationship to my valley via the water, and that's going to happen in one massive mega chapter. Okay, now I'm going to have the indigenous people and their relationship to the land and my brother's relationship to them. That's going to be in one massive chapter. And I started to realize that's kind of how the book was happening, being that I was writing it in an MFA program, which is kind of a workshop focused setting. And so I would have to sort of put it all in one chunk for people. But then when I finished the program and I kept working on it for 3 more years, I realized that what I needed to do was to sort of crack those things open and sprinkle them out throughout the entire book. And so that's what I did, and found that I knew that they all needed to be in there together, because they felt essential to sort of the family story that I was telling. When I think about my own family's existence, the story of us it's inextricable from the story of the landscape and the place. I couldn't have told one without the other. They were both, I tried at one point rewriting this as a chronological memoir, and it just completely fell flat. It was just sort of an exercise And I kept some paragraphs from that, but it was clear that that was not the form that the book really needed to have. So it was just a matter of figuring out how to pace the different aspects, the past, the present, kind of not really staying chronological with my own life in the book too. That sort of, because I was diving into the past so frequently, it felt almost more right to really have a very loose relationship with chronology in the present as well. So it was a lot of trial and error and a lot of just going with my gut as far as, yeah, I think this is really part of the story. This needs to be here. How am I going to fit it in?
Yeah, well, I'd like to just open it up. Yeah, feel free to ask the questions, guys, or you can type them into the chat. So Nick, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nick. I teach at GVC. So it was Memoir first. It wasn't like you were interested in water or Owens Valley and then realized Memoir was the thread that you could pull through all of these things. Yeah, kind of, I guess, because I could see an awesome biography of Mary Austin with all the stuff that you pulled together. Right? So I guess, yeah, just from a craft perspective, it starts as Memoir, then all this other stuff comes along, or all this stuff is what you want to write about, and Memoir is the way you make that link.
Yeah, the latter. When I first started writing this, I had been writing about my my family and where we were from sort of reluctantly a little bit, even in college when I first took a class on nonfiction writing. Because at first I was like, oh, I want to be a writer. I took a fiction writing class. I'm like, I really don't understand how to write a plot. At that time, that was not that did not make sense to me. And then I took a nonfiction writing class. And before that, I didn't even know that creative nonfiction or the essay was a literary genre. And the assignment was to write about grief. We had an assignment that was to write about grief. So I wrote an essay about my mom and my weird friend and me in high school, like wandering around the streets of our neighborhood, dressed in like goth outfits in the rain. So I wrote this essay, and the landscape and my feelings about my family and it was all coming together in that. And that ended up being a part of my grad school application, but I never would have dreamed at that time. It was sort of like, well, I wrote this, but I would never want to show this to anyone. I would never want to keep writing this. I wanted to write essentially, if you've read Ian Fraser's Great Plains, I wanted to, which is basically him writing about the Great Plains with very minimal presence of himself. He's not from there, for one thing. So that's what I was wanting to do. And I had grad school professors say, yeah, but you are from here. So if you take, they sort of said, if you want this to be less of a regional book and more of a not so regionally specific, but maybe interesting to people from elsewhere kind of book, your story and your family story is going to be that narrative spine and that connecting line. So it started the other way. And then I realized I had to bring that stuff in because that was sort of what was drawing me to be obsessed about writing about this place in the first place, was a lot of unfinished business with it. But it definitely didn't start that way, partly because I was still living it, a lot of it. The fire that opens the book happened when I was in the middle of grad school, and I had already been writing this for some time. So I was still the book sort of traces this process of me realizing I wanted to go home, realizing what going home was going to mean, practically and emotionally, through doing a lot of research. So I think that stuff necessarily came later.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm glad that your professors talked you into sharing it.
That was good advice. When you're 23 or 24, you don't really think that you can write a memoir. But I think that it's not really a memoir. And to me, it has elements of memoir, but yeah, I don't know. To me, it feels more like a book-length essay.
And I read it as environmental nonfiction. I come from an eco-critical background, so I thought like maybe I'm importing some of just all my other reading. but I definitely read it as nature writing. So I was interested to see that you win awards in multiple sort of areas. It's like, no, it's nature writing. No, it's memoir. No, it's literature of the West. However you can categorize it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, which would give reviewers an easy out. They would pick, if they were gonna, the review they have pick something that they don't like. Well, they either thought it should have been pure memoir or pure environmental something. Like they were pretty much like divided. So it was funny to see like how people I think the chronology and the non-linearity and the jumping around in time when people were expecting a memoir would surprise some people, but I kind of liked that, surprising them.
And it's kind of a classic of the genre too. Like, you can't separate person from landscape, right? You can't tell the memoir without it being a story of place. And I don't know, that's how I.
Yeah, my favorite books of all genres are books that are very tied to setting, where setting isn't just, okay, let's set this in a random wherever, it could be anywhere. This story could have taken place anywhere. For me, my favorites are always the place looms large in the characters' lives, even if it's fiction.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask a question about some of the many texts that you reference in the book. I enjoyed a lot of those, how you work in quotes and references. I was just wondering about some of those authors like Mary Austin, who you kind of return to a lot, but then also like, you mentioned stuff from Joan Didion and like, Wallace Stegner and Ellen Meloy. I was just wondering, like, before you started working on the book, had you already read all of those authors? Were you already really familiar with them, or was that part of your research? Did you go back as you were working and kind of familiarize yourself with some of those texts?
Yeah, when I first started writing this, I hadn't read much of anything. I wasn't a literature major. I was a media studies major. And so I had read a lot of theory. I had read a lot of zines, but I hadn't read, I really was kind of ignorant when it came to the canon. I was kind of ignorant when it came to the Western canon, the environmental canon. So all of that, I was reading it while I was writing the book. And so for example, Ellen Meloy, who's she writes beautifully about the desert. I took her book, Anthropology of Turquoise, with me on this trip that I made through several of the most drought-stricken little California towns in I think it was 2014. And I was in the middle of writing about my relationship to my home and how the drought was coming in and playing a role in that, and reading her for the first time. So a lot of the book is sort of like pretty accurately chronicling my discovery of these ideas and them sort of starting to play into this decision to come home. So that was happening in real time. I never really thought about how it would have been different if I had already known those texts. But I feel like when I think about this book, I couldn't have written it at a different stage in life. It kind of had to be written during my 20s, relatively close to the events that were difficult, that were keeping me away from home, to sort of this this broad general awakening of the world to, oh yeah, like climate change isn't just an abstraction, it's actually affecting everybody's daily life. That was really kind of ramping up in the West right then. So I think that was the moment to be writing it. And it was useful in a way to have been a little bit naive to a lot of what other writers were talking about, and to be meeting them as I was going through the process of writing the book and making those discoveries on the page for the reader to come along.
I had a comment and then a question, Kendra. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is such a beautiful book, and I live in a very rural place in northeastern Nevada, and there was, when you were talking about the book not being able to be categorized, it made me feel like, and you talk about this about your dad in the beginning of the book, about the many hats that we have to wear when we live in a rural area. and how it isn't as easy to pigeonhole rural people as perhaps the stereotype would lead people to believe. So I was really grateful for that kind of acknowledgement throughout the book, is that there was the many facets of the folks living in your area. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about your town and the reception of the book after winning all these awards.
Yeah, well, that's nice to hear, because your comment's nice to hear, because I definitely was thinking about rural people when I wrote this book. I wasn't thinking about New York. I wasn't really thinking about the publishing industry, or I was thinking about the West, and I was thinking about rural people. So it's nice to hear that. And locally, the reception has been really nice. I mean, the book came out in the middle of the pandemic, and the tour didn't happen. A lot of that stuff didn't happen, and I didn't really have a feeling of, I didn't really get to interact with people about it. But what made up for that was the excitement and support and generosity of the local community. I know my dad has been asked on several dates as a result of this book. So that's always funny, but people will recognize him when he's delivering maps and be like, "Oh yeah, you're the tall beanpole guy." So it's just, it's a small town where people kind of already knew me and kind of already knew him. But what he said about that, because I asked him, I'm like, "How do you feel about this? Now all of a sudden everybody knows all this personal stuff about you." He's like, "It's kind of nice to have people know your story beyond just like superficially, and it's nice to." They like knowing your story. So I feel like he feels like it's drawn him closer to the community as a whole. And people will maybe open up about stuff that they've experienced because they feel like that channel has been opened, and that's been nice. And yeah, the local bookstore has an entire wall of Miracle Country, which is really sweet. And it helped them. They said that it helped them get through the pandemic. So the timing was actually good in that sense, because they had all, locals going in and buying it, and then tourists would come in and buy it. And that helped them get through a relatively economically challenging year. So I was happy about that. That made me feel better about the timing. So yeah, the reception locally has been incredibly heartwarming, and people have just been wonderful. So, and I had no idea if that would be the case. You really don't know. I really didn't know if others would see things the way I saw things. I'd been gone for a long time too. So maybe I was out of touch with how locals were feeling, although I would visit a lot. So I was really happy about that.
That's great. I love that your dad got some dates out of it.
Nothing is stuck yet, but
yeah, but
we'll see. I'm kind of curious. I don't know if you guys are okay with me asking you questions, but I'm kind of curious where everybody's calling in from.
Sure. So I'm actually in Elko right now. I'm the Humanities Center Coordinator here at Great Basin College. But so the Elko is the main campus, Elko, Nevada. But I live in Tuscarora, Nevada, which is 52 miles from here, and it's a former mining town. So I really related to quite a bit of the mining references. And there's a pottery school there that's been there since the 60s, and so we have I would say about a dozen artists that live there off and on throughout the year. But there's 14 full-time residents that live there. So it's pretty isolated, and it's surrounded, the valley is surrounded by 5 cattle ranches. So it's ranching country as well. So it's mining and ranching combined.
Yeah, that sounds like what we were before we became tourism.
Right. Yeah, and the resistance to being like, that conflict about whether to have tourism be an industry is always kind of, the tension is always there for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I work at the Winnemucca Center of GBC. Winnemucca is really more like northwestern Nevada, but I live in Reno, so I'm currently at home.
And Reno's just a stone's throw from us. We get special in-state tuition at UNR, even though we're technically California. we're more like Nevada.
Yeah.
And I'm actually in Winnemucca. I loved the book because in Winnemucca we're a mining and ranching town. And right now can everyone hear me okay? I think my internet's going in and out, but I work for the news, I'm a writer for the newspaper. And so there's a lithium project, a proposed lithium project. It's a mine. It would be an open pit mine that's proposed about 70 miles north of here. And there's a lot of controversy around the water and what that's going to do to the area. And one of the ranchers that's involved in a lawsuit against the BLM for their environmental impact study and decision on that. To my knowledge, I was told that he had lived in Southern Oregon ranching and then came down to Northern Nevada after he lost everything there because of the over appropriation of water and then the land drying up and all of that kind of same story. And so reading this book, I'm like, it's such a common theme in the West. And I don't think we realize how greatly it impacts different pockets and these different communities experience it. And they just kind of deal with it as it comes and as they need to. You re-drill your well when you need to re-drill your well or drill a different one. And it's a hardship for those individual people. But this book did such a great job of presenting the collective struggle and how, even toward the end when we talked about, or the book talked about the Paiutes being driven out and, well, this is our valley now, so you guys leave. It kind of in the way that it is with water too, like the resources, the way people come in and say, well, I have more money and power, so you got to go and this is mine now. Like it's just crazy how that happens time and time again. And that's a common theme, but it was beautifully expressed in the book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that I'm sad to hear that other communities go through those things, but I'm happy to hear that resonates. Yeah, because for me, coming to think of it, the drought was really what forced me into thinking like, oh my gosh, this isn't just a book about like private and personal loss. This is a book about this public change, public loss that's sort of happening. And then I think, as you said, so you brought up this idea that this has been happening in different ways multiple times in these types of communities. And in the sense of my own valley, it's like somebody used the term a chain of predation, where you have the ranchers coming in and taking it from the Paiutes, and then you have the Los Angeles coming in and taking it from the ranchers. So it's sort of this chain. And so to me, it felt like kind of gaining more of a historical understanding of that would help to think about it in the present. So that was definitely one of my goals, because that was something that I was learning as I wrote.
Right. And where's the accountability? It seems like it just kind of gets passed down. You talk about the Mulholland, is that his name, digging the ditch and then designing the whole system that takes the water from the valleys where it originates. And there isn't any accountability, because it's like, well, these people all need it, so you guys can just deal with nothing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then each generation inherits a new version of that.
Hi, I'm from Elko currently, but I spent most of my life outside of Lancaster, California. Born and raised there. So I lived between Lancaster and Edwards Air Force Base. We had 12 families on an artesian well, and it was fine growing up, and it just got worse and worse and worse as the water levels dropped, and the small farms were all bought by huge companies, and they would put in bad crops that intentionally wasted as much water as possible in order for to place their position for water rights futures. And it was just incredible. When I was growing up, it was almost entirely alfalfa, and then it changed to all these high high water usage crops and they would flood by the side of the road. It's like, hello, we live in the Mojave Desert. You know, what are you doing? I mean, people would get in their cars and drive to the farms and demand to see the managers going, you know, you have 2.5 feet of standing water next to the road. I mean, and all of the things that brought in with it, from, you know, mosquitoes to weeds nobody had ever seen, anything else. It was just, I left 16 years ago, and it's like, you know, I just can't play this game anymore. I just can't do it. So, and that was one of the reasons why I'm like, I'm out of here. And I would never, ever live, unless I solely owned a well, I would never, ever share with 11 other families again, a well like that. It's just too high risk.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. I did not know stuff like that was going on, as far as them trying to create a sense of a false, well, there is a water scarcity, but sort of trying to leverage that and worsen that so that they can secure water in the future. Wow. And these are things that people east of the 100th meridian don't even have to think about, like sharing a well with other families, what local industry is doing to ruin, you know, residential water access. Yeah, wow, that's crazy.
And I'm Nick Cooley. I teach on the Elko campus at GBC, but I'm from North Idaho, and then I came here after 7 years in Iowa City. So mostly had pretty decent access to water in my life.
So you experienced the contrast of the Midwest, the green and the humidity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I went from Iowa City, and yeah, the humidity and the, like, people talked about being claustrophobic in Iowa City if they came from, say, Nebraska or Eastern Montana, and they'd come to the writer's workshop or something, and just too many trees. They would say, like, I need open spaces. And coming from North Idaho, it's like, wait, this is about as open as it gets, isn't it? It's just cornfields. But it was, yeah, something about literally just the color green, that many types of green and that much green. It like caused anxiety for people.
Yeah,
No,
it's
that's funny.
overwhelming.
No, that's funny that you said that, Nick, because I had that. I mean, I'm from South Carolina originally, so it's very green. I'm from the coast, and it's a very lush and, like, you know, fertile environment. But when I was in graduate school, a lot of my friends were from other parts of the country, and I actually had a guy from the Midwest tell me that he was frightened by the dense vegetation because he was, like, from the prairie, and he was used to the, you know, kind of more like you know, wide open spaces, like kind of endless horizon. And he said in South Carolina, he never knew what was around the corner because there was very little visibility, you know, like trees were always blocking your view. And I found that very strange when he told me that, because I had always lived there. But then when I came to Nevada, I was frightened by the wide open. I found the wide open spaces to be very overwhelming, and I felt very exposed and vulnerable. So it's funny. It's like whatever you're not used to, you know, that becomes a source of anxiety. It does, you know, it can go either way, I guess.
Yeah, that's so funny. Everybody has like their side of the spectrum of that experience. Before I moved to the Midwest, I went to Kentucky. I was visiting a bunch of grad schools, and I was walking around in the woods, and they were bare. Even the trees were bare, and I still felt like, what are all these trees, and are there what's around them? And it was really unnerving, and I did get used to it. Now I really love dark green, deep, misty forests, but at first it was really unnerving. And I had a friend when I lived back east, when I was in grad school, she was from back east, and she said, I feel nervous around mountains. She said, I feel like they're watching me. And that was so, she said, they make me feel claustrophobic. They're just like there, and they're looming there. And that was so interesting to me, because in my valley, we're ringed in mountains. And the sentiment that I would hear over and over again from people is, I feel like they're cradling us. Like they feel like they're guarding us and cradling us. So, but if you're not from there and you come and you're all of a sudden these giant stone walls are looming in the distance, I could see how that could seem ominous. And I also find it fascinating that different cultures and different times in history have found mountainous landscapes to be ugly. and frightening because it's not arable land. So it wasn't like, oh, let's travel there and make it a national park because it's so beautiful. So that we're not like biologically hardwired, I think, to find certain landscapes beautiful. Has so much to do with where we come from. And that's funny to think about because I really can't imagine being from anywhere else. It feels so ingrained, but I guess it's just all chance.
It's funny that you say that, because we're so isolated. We've had people come to visit who really freak out, about the wide open spaces and the lack of light at night and all the different things that we don't even think about anymore. And when I lived on the coast in Mendocino for a year, and everyone was like, oh, isn't that great being at the ocean? I said, it felt claustrophobic to me because that's a horizon that's inaccessible. It just didn't feel the same as the desert, the high desert did, as far as, I can go out into that horizon. And the ocean felt very inhospitable in that way. So it's interesting.
That's really interesting observation. I find the ocean terrifying. So.
But, one thing that has struck me with this book and other things I've read since I moved out here, on the East Coast, we have obviously a very limited understanding of like life in the West. And I'd never been out West really at all until I got this job. So like, all the stuff about, water scarcity and the sort of ruggedness of the environment, that's really lost on a lot of East Coast people because like the vision of California in particular that we often consume is just like, it's like LA, it's Hollywood or the Bay Area. Like we know there's like deserts out there, but we don't really realize that people live there, like it's just a really sort of incomplete understanding. And you get this sense of California as like this golden land and it's like, this land of opportunity and, and we don't realize how difficult it is in a lot of those places to sort of carve out an existence. So I mean, I've just learned a lot since I've lived out here. And Nevada is largely the same way. Like all we know about Nevada is Las Vegas back home, or like Reno 911 or whatever. Like we don't know about rural life in the West. So yeah, I'm a little less ignorant now, but I'm still learning.
That would be quite a surprise and quite a contrast to suddenly move into that. When I was working on the book, I'm really glad I worked on it in Minneapolis because I had to explain to those people what drip irrigation is. I had to explain to them that rain shadow is not a metaphor, it's like a scientific term. And I had to add the maps in the beginning of the book because people did not seem to understand that this was not a suburban sprawl between all the different places that I was talking about. There was no concept of just like miles and miles of brush. That just wasn't part of the public imagination at all. So I had to be very clear, and I didn't realize that until I had professors say, you're driving through the suburb. And I'm like, no, I'm not driving through the suburbs. Like I'm literally driving down a mountainside and I'm surrounded by sagebrush. So I had to go in and and that was interesting to me that was not something that people could even visualize.
No, I found the maps helpful.
Did your dad help you with the maps?
Those were taken, like sort of took his maps. They're not like, useful to obviously scaled maps. They're more like conceptual maps. Like if my valley was the size on California in the map in the book that it is, that would be, we would be a much bigger deal. So they're really conceptual, but I took his maps and I used them to sort of do the general layout. And then an illustrator did the actual maps. I drew some very like rough, hideous versions for her and she made them look good. But even that she'd been to Bishop, this particular illustrator, and she lived elsewhere. And even with that, the first version of Bishop that she drew on the map, I don't know if you guys, I'll grab it. The first version of Bishop that she drew, it looked like a town back east. And I had to say, no, you got to make it like look kind of, Main Street looks like Wild West. You got to make it these like Wild West facades, and you need to put a truck. So that, she couldn't just insert, random town. I was like, no, this has to look like a distinctly Western downtown, with the connected buildings and the sort of flat, boxy, square buildings, and very minimal trees, no trees. And a truck, an old truck.
I don't want to shift gears too much, so anybody can tell me to shut up and interrupt me. But I was kind of wondering about, because a lot of what we teach in the background, I come from a literature background, so it's all about research, right? It's about trying to open up texts by going into archives and stuff. So I was wondering if maybe you could just talk about your own research process. And you mentioned going to museums, like little local museums a lot, or maybe going into archives and finding old newspapers. So I was just kind of wondering if you could maybe walk us a little bit through your process, how you even decide which museums and archives to go to. Do you go looking for something specific, or are you kind of like, I'm just going to show up to the market or the flea market and see what's there? Or
Yeah. Well, in my valley, in our 90-mile corridor, we have 3 museums. So there weren't too many decisions with that. It's like, this is the one you go to. We have one museum in Owens Valley, and it's 45 minutes south of me. And it has a really good archive and a lot of oral histories. And it has dentures made out of coyote teeth that some prospector melted down a plastic toothbrush handle and stuck coyote teeth in and made his dentures. So you can see those. I highly recommend it if you ever come through Independence. So yeah, I went to the only places that were available really for that kind of stuff. But I also looked at a lot of microfilms of old newspapers when I was in Minnesota, because I had access to that huge university library system. So I really took advantage of that. I read a lot of other historians' history books, because a fair amount has been written about the water conflict. A fair amount has been written about Mary Austin. And I went and I kind of wanted to find primary sources whenever I could instead. So I would go and look at their source, and I was amazed at how often what I would find was, these were pop history books. So, these weren't peer reviewed. And I was amazed at how often what I would find wasn't really, they had made an error, either intentionally or not. And what was real was way more interesting. I would often find that, or they had embellished in some way that I would then say, this is an embellishment, and I wonder why this historian felt compelled to, change the, whether the moon was full or not there at all during the massacre at Owens Lake, things like that. So it kind of, the research, being really transparent about my research process in the book, I think gave me a chance to sort of wrestle with the way other people have thought about this place throughout history. And so I tried to really put it on the page, the research process. So it was mostly microfilms, other people's history books, and the internet, a lot of very boring fact checking just to make sure. And then of course, still there's errors that slip through, a few that we're fixing in the second edition of the paperback. And then I talked to people. I talked to local people a lot. That was really important, was going around and sort of towards the end, checking what I had written, mostly with Indigenous folks and tribal elders, just to make sure that, just have a conversation to make sure that how I was representing things, at least with those individuals, sort of resonated, sort of doing my due diligence in that way. And then just taking a lot of notes on the stuff we were just talking about, the different ways that people in the West think of themselves versus the way the rest of the country thinks of that part of the country. And then just being really aware and taking notes whenever I was home, in contrast to how things had changed, just bike rides with my dad, seeing a cattle head on the middle, just weird stuff that happens in weird little towns, and just trying to be really aware and take a lot of notes, and then sort of synthesize that with the more academic part of the research. I read a lot of master's theses a lot of people in Southern Californian colleges really like to write their master's thesis on the water conflict up here. And so I read a lot of those, and one woman even interviewed Mulholland for hers back in the 1920s and took a walk with him. And so and she's just a graduate student, and there's her thesis unpublished, but available. So that kind of stuff was great.
And did it change the memoir aspect of it at all? Because like when you're thinking about a project that's, you know, a project about memory, right? And then you start doing the historical research and you're like, wait, why did this person remember this differently than this person remembered this? And then that whole process of writing about your own memories and saying like, wait, what does my brother remember? What does my sister remember? That's super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way memoirists deal with memory is one of the most interesting things about memoir. In this book, I was sort of in the family sense got around that, in that, you know, it wasn't so much like I think what was important to me to get from my siblings wasn't as much, we all had pretty much similar feelings about childhood, similar sort of, we felt like it was an awesome childhood, but then I wanted to understand how they perceived like the break and the shift there, and then how they perceived the sort of reconciliation after that. So I actually did a lot of interviews with them. That's another thing that the research included, was hours and hours and hours of like formal recorded phone calls with my family members. And then fact checking my dad.
Kendra, I'm curious, what were some of your biggest takeaways and lessons and learnings overall throughout the book process of writing and publishing?
So you mean specifically about like publishing a book, or more general life takeaways?
Both.
Gosh, that's a good question, and a big question. The book writing and publishing takeaways, I'm really glad I didn't rush. I think if I had finished this book, because I had an agent fairly early in the process of writing this book, just a couple years into grad school, and she was really patient and she was a good editor. So because of that, I was able to give it the time that it needed. And I think if I'd been really eager to, you know, publish a book immediately upon finishing my graduate degree, you know, it's a 3-year degree. If I was like, I'm going to be done at that time, it would have been a little shadow of itself. It wouldn't have been something I could be proud of later. And so I'm really, really glad that I toiled away at it for 3 more years, stayed in Minnesota for 2 more years, because the distance was actually productive from writing about this stuff. And I'm glad I gave it time. I'm glad I had an agent that gave it time and read millions of drafts and revised for endlessly. So I'm really grateful that that's how it went. And I think that reading, I knew this when I was in grad school, because I was told this very explicitly by my professors, and it made sense, but it really came to play out and seem true, was that reading for me as a writer, and I would think for many writers, is 50% of it. Reading other writers, reading for craft ideas, reading for style ideas, seeing how other people have approached technical problems, understanding where you fit in the bigger conversation and historically. So yeah, like I consider still a solid half of my work is reading. When I was in grad school, when I was a student, I think it was more like 70% of the work was reading, and I think that was a good balance. And then life takeaways, I don't know. I guess I'm in Bishop now, so I think that the book helped me come to the realization that I did want to come back here, and I'm glad that I did that. And I'm glad it's not an easy place to live. So it's smoky a lot of the time. The economy is weird. My friends come and they live here for a few years and they can't buy houses and they can't get jobs, so they leave. So it's a hard place to live still. But the book helped me work through all my feelings about it and figure out where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do, really. I think if I hadn't written this book, I might have wound up just in a job and doing something else somewhere else. And I might have always had a slightly broken heart because of that.
And if
So
it's
you-
okay to ask.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sam.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
What do you do? Because you have talked in the book about how people kind of have to cobble together an income, and writers famously usually have to find a job to pay for their writing habit. So are you teaching, or are you able to find like a freelance career? Like, how do you make Bishop work?
Well, I've been lucky because there's been a lot of Nevada Reads and other things have had kind of a rolling succession of book events, of book stuff. So that won't last forever. I'm working on another book, but another big takeaway that I've had from this whole experience is don't have financial expectations for your books. First of all, because like you can't write to the market, and who wants to do that? That'd be boring and horrible. But also, it's so unpredictable. You really can't predict. You can usually if you want to predict that you won't make any money from your book. That's what you can usually safely predict. But I got lucky with this first one, and I was able to buy my house here in Bishop upon selling the book, and now I've just been kind of writing the other stuff that comes from it. But I also have I'm set up for when that ends. I have a little cottage on my property here, so it's actually 2 houses. So I have a renter, and I would rather get really filthy in the yard than email. So I do all the maintenance and that kind of thing, all the yard work and all the maintenance. I try to keep a really low overhead. That's really important. And I help my dad do the computer side he also owns some storage units here in the Valley. And he basically he can barely email. So he needed somebody when his business partner passed away a few years ago. He was like, can you do the bookkeeping? So I do that too. So, and a little bit of freelancing. But I really like to work like as much as I can, like not on the computer.
But you did find the old saying to be true that you can write about your home better when you're far away from it.
Yes, I did. I think, well, because I had fled home, and that was kind of I had fled home, and I was very homesick, even though I had fled home, and that was the impetus for the book. So if I'd never left, I couldn't have written it. And if I'd come back too soon, I don't think it would have been as good, because I needed the distance. I needed to see it from other people's eyes. I needed to understand other places, and I needed to miss it really badly for a really long time in order to get that clarity.
So first you were in LA for college, right? But you didn't start writing it till you went to Minnesota for your MFA?
I was writing, when I was in college, and I was in Southern California for about 6 years, and I was writing about here, but I wasn't thinking of it as a book. I was writing, graduate school application essays about home, but I had no idea what I didn't even know until I really got to Minnesota. I didn't even know what my thesis was going to be about. I just knew I wanted to write.
So I guess we can look forward to a book about Minnesota now. You got your distance, been away from it long enough, you can start missing the Twin Cities.
What I miss is the North Shore of Lake Superior. That I'm not really a city person, so I never really had that kind of like emotional connection to the Twin Cities. But the North Shore of Lake Superior, it's so different from here, but it's like related in a way, because it feels very wild, and it feels like it wants to kill you. And I felt at home there, so I would go up there every chance I could get and backpack and cross country ski in the winter. So I do love it up there. That is a landscape that I feel attached to now and that I would like to write about. But I also don't have, because I have such a deep and long relationship with here, when it comes to writing about other places, I almost don't really know how to begin, because I feel like my knowledge of them and my relationship to them is so superficial in comparison. So I'm going to have to get beyond that.
Do you see yourself writing fiction?
Yeah, actually, I think that the next book I write will be, and I think it will be completely different.
Cool. And what about teaching? Is that ever on the horizon? Is that an interest?
I think because of where I live, no. I don't want to chase teaching jobs, and I don't live in a place with a university. And it hasn't, to me, it was always writing was the main thing. I liked teaching when I was in the University of Minnesota, and I think there are probably more remote opportunities now, and I would probably be open to those, but it has never been something that I've been aggressively pursuing. It feels in some ways too similar to writing. Like I'm really selective about freelancing for that same reason. It feels too similar to this other side of my work.
Well, I had a question about Mulholland in particular. I just found him to be an interesting figure, and I liked how I felt like you were sort of tapping into a little bit of the ambiguity that exists with figures like him, because, on one hand, I mean, I don't know if this is an exaggeration, but it seems like he plays a very large role in making Los Angeles sort of like the huge city that it is today. So I think there's a lot of impulse in Americans to sort of like lionize that and to look at him. And I think he often has been viewed as somewhat heroic, or like a great example of the American dream, right? He's some like Irish immigrant. He's like a self-made man, he does these impressive things, but there's also like all the negative consequences that come about because of that. So yeah, I felt like that's always a sticky kind of thing to navigate with a lot of American historical figures who like tamed the West, like I do like early American lit. So we're always kind of wrestling with like these older sort of depictions of these characters as like heroes. And now we sort of might want to revise that, or like in the contemporary climate, we kind of we sort of reconsider a lot of those figures. And Mulholland kind of reminded me of that type of figure from history. It's like he did some important stuff and helped to build this really important city, but yeah, like at what cost? Like how do you, like so hard to balance that,
Yeah, that was probably the main source of tension for me in writing about Mulholland, and in my own thinking about him going from being a pure villain when I was growing up to something way more interesting than that, I think, and more complicated. And it is also something that I think about a lot, and I'm trying to actually write a little piece about that for some newspapers right now, which is how do we think about the quote unquote sins of the past, and things that figures in the past have done. And to me, that this is always evolving, but for now, the most interesting way to approach that is, so there are things, I think I think just purely vilifying because we are in our cultural moment now is less interesting to me than acknowledging that in Mulholland's case, I am impressed with things about him. I am impressed with I think he was in many ways a mathematical genius. He didn't actually have written maps and blueprints of the city of Los Angeles underground water system. He didn't have it written down, and he would be tested periodically. He would have to show where a particular pipe was, and he could tell them exactly where to dig and exactly what that connected to. So in a lot of ways, he was impressive. He was also answering a need that he did not entirely approve of, which was this sort of gratuitous water use in Southern California. but the boosters and the railroad were conspiring to flood people in, and developers were making a lot of money off of it. And his job was to provide water for those people. So I think it's more productive and more interesting to say, here was a person who had major failings in the sense that he failed to think outside of his cultural box, in the sense that he completely ignored the fact that there was already a population living in the valley that he dried up, mainly the indigenous people who had a way of living there with the water that was sustainable. And that just wasn't even, it was not, at that time, it was not like, how can we learn from this? Let's learn from this. And that's not the cultural moment that he was living in. So as a person in his cultural moment, this is what he did to answer that. This was how he responded to the task that was assigned to him by the culture at large. On the other hand, there are people who lived in his day and age, like there are examples of people throughout history, I'd say in any era, who did rise to the challenge of thinking outside of that cultural box and recognize the things that were unjust. And they were ahead of their times, of the majority in that sense. So I don't think we can completely let these people off the hook, people like Mulholland off the hook for kind of catering to their times, or as one of my professors put it, and I really like this expression, getting some of the burrs of his era on him as he walked through life. I think it's both. I think we have to hold them accountable while also acknowledging that we are in our cultural moment, and there's probably plenty of things that we are blind to that will seem very obvious to future generations. So that's kind of what I like to do with that, is instead of having it be like Mulholland's a villain, okay, here's the ways that Mulholland failed to be a better thinker, and here are the ways that I, as the writer of this book, may be failing in the same ways that he failed. So it's basically, I just like to complicate it as much as I can.
But yeah, that was something that really came across, I think, in the text. And I had read some other stuff to sort of that effect, this idea that a lot of these parts of the West, that area of Southern California probably wasn't ever really meant to sustain a huge human population, and I could sort of relate to that, even though I'm from the other side of the country, because like where I'm from on the coast, like it's very swampy and low lying, and of course for us flooding and hurricanes are the big threats, kind of the opposite problem that we have out here. But there's been this rampant development on really low lying lands that it's not gonna last, because that stuff's gonna be underwater in a few decades, like we pretty much know it. But it's really been a lot of unscrupulous housing developers who just disregard environmental protections, and they build on wetlands. They build in swamps that are, they have standing water there half the year. I mean, and there's rampant flooding, and there's just a lot of problems that come along with that. So it kind of reminded me of that. Just like it's like this human's insatiable need to build more houses and build more towns. And you go to these parts of the country that really can't safely accommodate those people, but we do it anyway. And that just kind of gets repeated over and over again.
Yeah, it's unfortunate being a species that is very good at solving immediate problems and not very good at thinking about the very long-term consequences of that. I don't know if our technological power has developed more quickly than we've evolved this kind of long-range thinking as a species, or what. I'm sure there's people in other departments who can answer those questions better than I can, but it is something I think about a lot too.
Do you have any sense, after doing the research, living there for a while, maybe even book reviews, do you sense any sort of shift in attitude? And like, how do you take the pulse of LA? I don't know, but like growing awareness, or like the stories that you share in your book, does that move the needle at all with people living in an area where they're surviving on water that ultimately belongs to other places and other people? Or is it just kind of like, yeah, it's the consequences of living in the 21st century and progress and the economy and da 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 da?
Well, I probably have a very self-selecting sample group that I would hear from on this. So I don't know at large, and I don't track policy around water as well as in LA as I might to know if there's been a sea change of sorts. But I have heard from a lot of readers from Southern California and other large cities in the West who are super clued into this stuff, very aware of it, very passionate about it, very interested in the sort of colonial relationship of cities to satellite communities in the West with resources. And like I've had quite a few people refer to, in a sense, my region as, they call it their spiritual home, even though they live in, LA or something. And that was really interesting because, I grew up being a waitress to tourists in the restaurants around here and sort of resenting them. And it's been really cool to meet a pretty large subset of them who feel strongly enough about this stuff that they want to reach out and tell me about it, they want to tell me about their relationship to my area and how much they love it and care about it. And it's cool to think that there's essentially all these people that are stewarding it from afar. And I think that was a really cool thing to learn. I don't know if that's changed. I don't know if that's increasing. I think that probably beginning with the California drought, or that was affecting the entire West, but Californians really kind of got shaken by it in 2014, 2015, those years. It hasn't ended, right? We're still in the drought, but when that first serious wave of the drought hit, I think that it did kind of, people became a little more aware of a lot of this stuff. Urban people who might have otherwise been shielded from it, started to think about it some more. And now, when they're under smoke, or even urban people have to face threat of fire, I do think that it seems to be, maybe because climate disaster is ramping up, starting to become more on people's minds.
So do others have any questions?
Well, I was just going to comment real quick on what you just said, because part of what I think is, I've been thinking a lot about why do so many memoirs come out of MFA and nonfiction programs, and like, what is it about memoir? But when you read statistics or projections about global climate change and climate catastrophe, it's pretty easy to be like, like, how do you deal with those abstractions? But when we hear stories, not even about global climate change, but just about, here's what changes in water patterns do to a group of people who live in an area. It happened before European contact, it happened post-European contact, and it's going to happen again. So we can start to imagine a world without water in a new way, because we have, I don't know, something about your stories. It's more than just like humanizing the abstract. It's also sort of like these object lessons about, we call them externalities or whatever, like the true cost of your carrot or your hot tub or whatever it is. So yeah, the putting faces and voices and historical figures, inserting them into the abstractions, I thought was a really strong part of the book, and I really appreciated it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Kendra.
Sorry, I'm late. I'm in a different time zone. I thought I was here right on time, and I was super sad because I read your book and I loved your book.
Ethan, why don't you just introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, I'm Ethan. I teach history here at GBC. So anyway, your book had a lot of history in it, which was great. And I love the way you communicated that history through personal stories. And anyway, a lot of really great stuff. And I really appreciate, like you were saying when I came in, you talked about how you weren't trying to over villainize people, which was a great thing in your book, that it really, I think, helped us think about it in a complicated way that was refreshing. But my question was, I guess maybe you've already answered this, but I'm always kind of curious when I read these kind of memoir books, like, how do you deal with telling stories of, I guess, family members who are close to you? Like, and do you talk to them first? And how does it affect your relationship later when something like comes out like nationally about kind of your family? I mean, you put your family under a microscope, and I'm just curious about, because I read a lot of these and I'm always kind of curious about how it affects the family afterward or during the process.
Yeah, I'm great question and welcome. And sorry you missed the first part, but I'm pretty sure it's recorded. So I'm glad you're getting to join us now. My family are really generous and they have been fine with it the whole time. They've known about it. It was interesting because my relationship with my brother really got mended when the book was almost done. So in some ways I was writing about him when he was sort of still spun off in his little world, and feeling a little bit like, okay, I'm going to eventually have to have a conversation with him about this. And then by the time I did, he was so open and generous, and we had long talks, and I put in stuff from interviews with him. And I would say, are you sure you want this in? Are you sure you want that? And his response would always be, whatever will sell books. So I'm very lucky in that sense, and that he was just so generous with his story and pretty much no holds barred. And same thing with my sister and my dad. Everybody read it before it came out. Nobody wanted me to take anything out. A lot of it they'd actually told me in interviews for the purpose of going in the book. So I'm very lucky. And I think it actually brought me closer to them, because I feel like my dad feels as if his lessons as a parent sunk in and are almost like encapsulated in this book and held up. And I think it made my sister feel more that I understood what she was going through when we were both young. And I think my brother's just super easygoing and doesn't care. But I do think that overall it's brought me closer to them.
So Kendra, this is Nan. I'm actually in Michigan, and appreciated what you said about the Great Lakes and the North Shore of Superior. A while ago you said something about people in far-flung places who are sort of stewards, sort of unbeknownst maybe to people in the Owens Valley. And having grown up in Northern California in the 60s and late 60s, and always feeling that split between Northern and Southern California because of the water, and the South is stealing our water and so on. So even though I was in the Bay Area, the country that you write about was so important to me, hiking and backpacking in the Sierra Nevada, especially on the eastern side. And now, when I travel by plane from Detroit to San Francisco to see family, I'm always hoping I'll be able to look down at Mono Lake when I pass over the Sierra Nevada. So I find as a writer, trying to do a little bit of memoir, but mostly poetry, that here in Michigan, where I've lived for 30 years, I find I'm writing about the Sierra Nevada and Nevada. I love how lyrical your memoir is. So thinking, I don't know if you also write poetry, but it's so beautifully written. So mostly it's not so much I'm asking a question, but just really wanted to thank you for your writing.
Well, thank you. That's all really nice of you to say. And I'm glad that you got to have a relationship with our area.
It means so much to me.
That's great. See, and this is what's been so cool about the book, is just getting to meet people like you who know and love this place and yet are scattered all over the country. That's so cool. I hope you get to come back and visit. Right now, it's very beautiful fall.
I would love to.
So Kendra, I'm curious, Dan asked about poetry. Is that something that you do on your own?
Oh yeah, so I have only studied and written nonfiction. I dabbled with writing some short stories in grad school, but they were basically just essays with the names changed. But I think I want to mess around with writing fiction just because I spent so much time on this book that I'm just ready to do something that is completely super different. And you know, I'm in a different place in my life. I was in my 20s when I wrote this. It's the product of the 20s, and now the product of the 30s will be something else, I think. So I've never really written any poetry though. So maybe someday.
Kendra, I'm curious how your journey of writing kind of started and evolved. Like, how did you know that that's something that you really wanted to pursue, and how did that start for you?
When I was a kid, I really liked language almost like as a tactile material. I really liked words. I liked how words sounded together. I liked learning new words, and I've always related to the world very verbally, less than visually, I would say. So I just liked writing as a kid, just for fun, just goofing around and writing stuff. And yeah, I think to me, and maybe that's where the people make the poetry connection, is the actual material of the language is just as important to me as what is being communicated. That's half the fun, is just feeling like the language is a material that you can mold. So I guess I just felt like that since I was a small kid, and I've just been finding different ways to explore that. I like learning languages too. So yeah, I dabbled in a little bit of writing classes in college, and then really felt serious about it after college. Which I'm glad I didn't study it exclusively in college, because I think it was important for me to get a background in critical thinking first, and then go on and learn the writing technical skill and craft later.
I was also interested in that the thread of Lupinland throughout the book. So there's like storytelling and narrative and creation already in your life, even before maybe you think about writing, because you have that imaginary world that your mom built, and then I assume that you then all built together as you kept revisiting it.
Yeah, I could probably thank my mom in large part for being a writer, that I'm a writer, because I have a bunch of letters. I put some chunks in the book, letters she wrote to my grandmas, and they're really funny, and they're really like, just her observation of detail is really keen. And she was a teacher, so she was never really, she would write a lot for other things, but I think that that's probably where I got it from, is that interest in phrasing and timing and stuff like that, and also storytelling. And she would read books to us out loud. Like my whole childhood, there would always be a book in progress that the whole family would sit around and listen to her read. It helped that we were literally halfway up a mountain, nowhere near any other children, and we weren't allowed to have television. So that helped. There wasn't a whole lot else to do but sit in the dirt with the lizards and make up stories.
After the fact of not having television, are you glad that that was the case for you?
I'm really glad. I know nothing about popular culture to this day, and it's embarrassing sometimes, but mostly I think it was an advantage. I think that being kind of feral as a kid really helped me as a writer. My high school was also very underfunded, very unstructured, and probably very poorly ranking in the standardized test world. And I used to think that was really bad. When I went to college, there was a really pretty big difference between me and the other kids. And I think I was in there helping them fill a rural quota. And wow, I really struggled that first year. But then my advisor, years later, she told me, she's like, you had an advantage because you came in not knowing how to check boxes, not knowing what, academia, how to write a proper, cited essay. You knew nothing, but so you kind of were, I think it helped me with thinking. I think it helped me think in a way that was maybe less structured and less goal oriented. And that's probably horrible for a lot of professions, but really good for a writer.
That's great, Kendra. My husband and I, we have two children, and they both went, or one of them is still in a two-room schoolhouse in the Valley. And we've often struggled with their education as far as they're not exposed to pop culture. They have I said, are they going to be really hurting when they go out into the world and not understand any of these references? But so I'm really glad to hear that you don't feel like, I'm always afraid they're going to hate us, but so I'll hope that they have a similar response that you do.
I'm sure someday. I think when I was a teenager, all I wanted to do was lurk around in Hot Topic, and I lived 6 hours from the closest Hot Topic, which I don't know if those still exist, but they're like a mall store with like punk stuff. And so I did hate my parents for making me live where I live just the last few years of high school when I really wanted to just be at malls. But that didn't last very long. That lasted like maybe a year.
Well, it's so funny that malls have kind of become archaic now, almost. Like I think, in my youth, I lived around a lot of typical suburban trappings. But even that stuff's changed today. Like between like the beginning of the 2000s and today, like kids don't congregate at malls in the same way that they did 20 years ago. Even in the suburbs now, it seems like kids are more isolated. Kids spend more time like indoors no matter where they are, it seems like. I mean, perhaps not in mall. Yeah, but even, I don't know, like even the suburbs have kind of undergone this kind of weird transformation, I think, as a result, I think, in large part of technology.
Yeah, I'm so happy that I didn't grow up with like smartphones, and MySpace was like only a thing in the very end of my adolescence. I think everybody here is probably in the same boat. Yeah.
Facebook came along when I was in college. So I was kind of on the tail end of it. But Nick, I thought you were going to ask a question about Mary Austin at some point.
No.
I was just wondering.
I've taught Mary Austin before.
I know.
Cool.
That's why I thought you were going to broach the subject. But I mean, I was just wondering how did you get into her? When did you start reading her?
I first read her in college, actually. I didn't really know about her until I went to college, and then I got assigned. I got assigned to Land of Little Rain, and I was like, wait a second, this is about where I'm from. And so that was kind of surprising. And then I didn't really think about it for a few more years and really came back to her strongly. Her autobiography, I think, is what really cracked her open for me. It's called Earth Horizon, and it's really interesting. And she refers to herself in the third person all the time, and she's a real kook. So I loved getting to know her through her writing. That's cool that you've taught her. What of hers have you taught, Nick?
Land of Little Rain. That's either I will pull individual essays out and kind of weave those into a class with other short stories and essays, but yeah, for the most part I just teach the book The Land of Little Rain.
Yeah, I love that one. I feel like she was really ahead of her time, and both ahead of her time and also not ahead of her time, in the sense that she was really just kind of listening to the people that were already there and sort of trying to introduce a lot of those ideas to her culture. There was a great article, I think I put this in the book, there was a great article that she wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1905. And she says, is all of this necessary so that Los Angeles be just so big? And I was like, wow, that was not what people were saying in 1905.
Yeah, no, that you've got that quote. She refers to it as the idiot excitation of mere bigness.
Yeah,
it's just like such a good phrase.
And that was such a time of God has ordained us to develop the desert and grow our cities and more and more and more and more. And she was just like, no.
Yeah, and I've always kind of been interested. There's one image, I think it might be in the very first essay in the book, where there's this. She's talking about the outside conception of the desert having no life, but then as you zoom in, you can start to see life in the desert. And there's this one image of, in the middle of the day, you'll have like sparrows and hawks sitting in the same line of shade from a fence post. And so not only is there life, but there's those hints of there are ways that we can develop these spaces that still allow for the sparrows and the hawks and the fence builders to kind of like share it.
Yeah, and that's maybe something that folks in Nevada have seen in your communities. Maybe we see that here, where the ag people and the environmentalists tend to be a lot less divided than they are in other places, other parts of the country, because of that, because of stuff like that. There's ways that the ag people can provide habitat, and everybody wants water to stay. So people are kind of on the same page about some stuff. I also love just Austin's keenness of observation with things like that. And anyone who's ever waited at a crosswalk in the desert and seen the people lining up in the shade from the from the thing can relate to that, those hawks.
And just anecdotes you hear about her. I read one where, people had heard about where her little house was, and they had come as kind of like tourists, kind of like, and she was standing out in her yard, and she like was spraying them with a hose, telling them get the heck away. Don't know if it's true, but I love that image of a little Mary Austin.
Her house is very much unchanged. It's really cool. It's still right in Independence. One of my favorite things about the research about her was finding a bunch of interviews that had been done with local women who lived here at the same time as her. And I think I have like a pile up of their quotes somewhere in the book, and they're all saying stuff like, she was kind of peculiar, she was pretty weird, her mind was always somewhere else. It was just sort of this one after the other, these women just being like, yeah, that Mary Austin, I don't know.
So as we wind things down here, do we have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, just thank you very much. I really appreciate the book, and I really appreciate that you took the time to come visit us today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Kendra. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was a lovely book. Really, really good.
Thank you. It was great to talk to all of you. I'm really happy we were able to have kind of a conversation here.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. And we'll do this again when you publish your next book.
That's right.
Okay.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to get you on the calendar. So I just want to thank the Nevada Humanities, the Nevada Center for the Book, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. They're the sponsors and supporters of the Nevada Reads program that made this all possible. And we at the Humanities Center at Great Basin College are grateful to be able to partner with them. So thank you so much, Kendra. It's been such a pleasure. And this will be recorded, so we will share it with students and other faculty that weren't able to join us today. And are you in Las Vegas right now for the book festival?
I'm leaving.
Oh, you're in Bushwick
after this.
Oh, you are. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like a fantastic lineup. I've been kind of watching it from afar, so that should be a wonderful experience as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Nevada Humanities for all of this.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Great. All right, everyone have a wonderful weekend. And next month we're doing Indian horse. So please join us for that conversation.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
Keep on growing that hair and beard, Sam.
Oh, there's no stopping it now.
All right. I wanted to know why Ethan's in a different time zone.
That's what I was going to know too.
Like, what are you doing in a different time zone during a global pandemic?